Thanks, music team. Hello. Let's pray. Father, thanks for today, for this text, and it's good to be together. It's just good to be together. It's good to just be able to enjoy each other's company, to worship you. Pray just really bless us, and maybe we're really glad that we've been here today. We just commit this time to you in Jesus' name, for your glory's sake. Amen. Alrighty, so today we get to start a new series, Book of Exodus, and Exodus is a really significant book, isn't it, really? Important book. It's the second book of the Bible. It sort of helps set the whole thing up. The whole story, the whole narrative gets set up through Exodus. And really, what's it about? I don't know if you sort of stopped in the street. So what's Exodus about? What would you say? Well, probably it's many ways a story about deliverance. It's a story about God's faithfulness. It's a story about failure of God's people. And most importantly, though, it's a story about God's relationship with his people. See, God is a God of relationship. And that very much comes through the whole of the story of Exodus. And today, relationship comes at us, though, in maybe a bit of a different way. It comes to us through the lens of oppression, okay? And that's a really important subject for us to talk about as well, isn't it? Oppression. It's important because Jesus tells us, and also I think we could probably add history tells us, that if we follow Jesus for long enough, eventually the winds of opposition are going to blow, and sometimes it's going to feel like they are blowing right through us. And that's certainly true in Australia, isn't it? Where things sort of that trajectory is going. That we know that. It's a common told narrative. In fact, I was just reading a book this week, and the author on that, well, the guy writing before it actually, just said something like this. He said, Christianity is not so much viewed as irrelevant these days, as more as a dangerous thought, a dangerous idea. And he said, you know what happens with dangerous ideas? They get taken out of the centre. Dangerous ideas get removed from schools, they get removed from universities, they get removed from being spoken of well in the media, and people just want to remove the platform. And that's certainly what's going on around the world, and certainly going on in Australia. Christianity, this dangerous idea, this new narrative that's been spoken in. We've talked about it lots of times, and it's important to talk about it because it's so true, isn't it? The winds of opposition. And it can be really lonely sometimes. If you're faced with that, it can be a really tough thing. Because it is just this deconstruction, if you like, that's going on in society. Deconstructing the narrative that we believe that we've lived under, and then there's some sort of reconstruction happening as well. And as Christians, we're out of step with that, just by default. We are out of step with that, and it can become really difficult. And so, we probably all know that to a certain degree, and this sort of raises the question of where we're going today is, what does God want us to know? What does God want us to know when we sort of are feeling the opposition? What does he want us to think? And really, the beautiful thing about Genesis 1 and 2 is it's really answering that question for us. What does God want us to know as we're facing maybe some difficult times? So looking at the first two chapters of Exodus, first two chapters of Exodus, wasn't right Bible reading after all, and looking at those first two chapters, it's a story, so let me tell you it as a story. This is how it goes. First 7 verses, let me just read them to you again. These are the names of the sons of Israel, who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Then the narrator names the sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All of these are the descendants of Jacob. Then there's one more, Joseph, who's already in Egypt. But all of these were 70 persons, it tells us, significant. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation died. But the people of Israel were fruitful, and they increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So that's kind of important information as you kick off a new book. it's sort of like when you hear that, hopefully you're thinking, oh, that's right. There's another story, isn't there? There's a story that started before Exodus, and that is the story of Genesis. And remember how that goes? God created us because he loved us, he loves us, but we walk away, we reject God, and then we try and fix things and we can't. So God steps in and he goes to a bloke named Abraham and he says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to make you a great nation. And I'm going to bless you, I'm going to give you many descendants like the stars of heaven, the sand on the sea, and I'm going to give you a land. So when you come to Exodus, and you kick off and it says there were 70 persons when they first came to Egypt, but by the end they grew exceedingly strong and they multiplied. We're supposed to say, oh, that's right, that's the covenant, isn't it? God's at work and he's blessing and they're growing. We're supposed to remember that. But then we're also supposed to say, oh, hang on a minute, aren't they supposed to have a land? But they're in Egypt, they're not in Canaan, they're not in the promised land. So I wonder what's going to happen there. Enter the story of Exodus. And this is how it goes. They're in Egypt. And so another great question is, why are they there? Why are they in Egypt after all? And that goes back to a couple of places in Genesis. Again, it's that Genesis narrative. I don't want to assume that you just know it. I want to make sure that you get it, because otherwise Exodus doesn't really make a lot of sense. But way back in Genesis chapter 15, the covenant that God makes with Abraham sort of comes up a couple of times in the Genesis narrative. And one of the times in Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, he says, Abraham, your descendants are going to leave this place, Canaan, and they're going to go and they're going to be strangers in a foreign land, and they're going to be oppressed in that foreign land, and they're going to be in that foreign land for 400 years, and then they're going to come back to the land of Canaan. And it just turns out that Egypt just happens to be that foreign land. So how did they get to Egypt? Well, that's the story of Joseph, remember? Joseph, he's the great-grandson of Abraham, and Joseph, the short version of the long story, he's hated by his brothers, he's sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt. Things go poorly, but then things go really well. I mean, he ends up as Prime Minister. It's a great rags to riches story. He ends up as Prime Minister of Egypt, and Egypt's going through a hard time. There's a famine, but Joseph is the man that delivers them. Really important point in the Exodus story. And then the brothers, because the famine is widespread, there's a famine in Canaan, they end up coming to Egypt as well. And they've written Joseph off, they think he's dead and long gone. But when they get there, it turns out that Joseph, their brother, is the Prime Minister, and in the end, he deals really kindly with them. And so does Pharaoh back in those days. Pharaoh says, Joseph, is this your family? Are these your brothers? And is this your father? Well, we're going to really honour them. And he gives them the land of Goshen, and they live in the land of Goshen. And things are going really well. But they know that they're not going to stay there forever. In fact, this is exactly how the last verses of the book of Genesis go. Listen to what it says, the last verses of Genesis. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you, and he will bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And that's it, the end of Genesis, right there. And so Exodus kicks in, and we're told that it's something like 400 years later, living in the land of Egypt, but not all is well. Things are going really poorly. In fact, and this is where the next part of the story is really a story about oppression. Okay? And I want to just tell the story. It's a good story, and I want us to see how it relates to us today as well. It's the story of oppression, and this is how it kicks in the first few verses. Verse 8 of Exodus. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many, and they are too mighty for us. So it sounds like this new Pharaoh is afraid. Come, he says, let's deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies, and they fight against us, and escape from our land. So Pharaoh, he's a man that's shrewd, he's a man that's really pragmatic. That's the idea, he's kind of being wise in his own eyes, and he says, well, these Jews, these Israelis, they're multiplying, becoming too big, it's getting out of hand. I'm just really afraid of where it's going to go. He's a man that's clearly concerned about his own nation, which is good, he's a leader, but probably to look at it maybe through a negative lens. He's concerned about his own glory, concerned about his people doing better than another people and his people really dominating. He's concerned about all of those things. And so he starts being shrewd, pragmatic. What can we do to shut these guys down? And this is where the oppression kicks in, doesn't it? At first, he says, well, let's make life really difficult for them. Hopefully we can just make them really weak. They won't reproduce as much like rabbits, these guys. So let's just make them really weak. So he puts them to work in the brickyards, building his cities, oppressing them and making life really hard. But the more he does, this is really interesting, isn't it? The more he does, the text tells us, the more the people multiplied. It's kind of cool. Because it's like, God's at work behind the scenes here. This is covenant language again, isn't it? I'll bless you and make you a great nation. So no matter how hard this great king over this great land tries, he just can't shut down God's people. So he thinks, well, I'll try something else, And it gets even darker. This time it's infanticide. And so he calls in the Hebrew midwives and he says, if it's a girl, fantastic, she can live. But if it's a boy, you've got to kill him. So why does he do that again? Well, I think it's just convenience. It's pragmatic, it's convenience, and it's like, this is just going to be better for us. We'll just kill boy children, thin their numbers that way. It's pretty horrible. It's evil. It's not the only time we read a story like that, is it? You roll forward to the New Testament and we have the Nativity story. And Herod does exactly the same thing. Herod hears that there's a king that's been born in Bethlehem, and he's worried, he's afraid. So he goes in and he says, kill all the boys that are 2 years old and younger. It's just a horrible story about convenience and pragmatism, doing whatever it takes to get our own way. I feel like I just need to pause for a minute on that. What do you think? In some ways I think that there is a story there for us about our society as well. And surely the very thing that Christians of all denominations and right across the globe have had a problem with about modern abortion laws has been this same thing, hasn't it? It's about convenience. It's about pragmatism. It's about, I don't really want to have this child right now. And so we'll just terminate it. Either outside the womb or inside the womb. It's still the same story. And I know there's a lot of exceptional stories, and there are times when we need to really show compassion to people because they are dealing with quite a lot along those lines. But it is an important thought for us to hear, nonetheless, about the problem of convenience. See, because in God's eyes, taking a human life is a great evil. Humans, people are created in the image of God. We're created in His likeness. There is a dignity. And we need to remember that, and we need to hear that in today's world. We're just so thankful to God that there is grace and there is forgiveness, that there is the gospel. No matter how far we've fallen or whatever we've done, we can come back to Him, and there is that beautiful forgiveness and no judgment in Jesus. So that's the great news, but we still need to hear things for what they really are. See, Pharaoh in this story, he has no regard for human life. And they're a problem. Let's just terminate them. Let's get rid of these boys. And so he calls in the Hebrew midwives. But there's something really interesting about this passage, isn't there, as we reflect on it. These two Hebrew midwives are named. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. In fact, they're the only people named other than the patriarchs right at the beginning of the chapter, in chapter 1. You think, well, I don't know why they are named. I think it's probably not that hard to work out. I'm not actually told, but I think God is just honouring them. These are courageous women. Courageous women that are prepared to stand against Pharaoh. And then I was thinking about that, and don't you reckon this is true? That there's always something that we fear. See, Pharaoh's afraid. He's afraid of the Israelites and what's going to happen if he doesn't control their numbers. But the Hebrew midwives are afraid as well. They're afraid of God. It tells us that they feared God, and so they wouldn't carry out the king's commandment. Now that's good, isn't it? We all fear something. Now what is it that you fear? Because the winds of opposition blow in this world. And it probably is going to make us afraid, isn't it? We're just going to say, oh, I don't know. What is it that we fear? And the beautiful thing about these Hebrew midwives is they actually fear God. And so they say to the Pharaoh, well, the Hebrew women are too vigorous for us. By the time we get there, they've already had the baby, the show's over. And I guess, is that true? Well, probably. I have to check with Lillian later on because I'm no midwife. But I guess if you're working in the brickyards and you're fit and you're strong, then maybe it's going to be easier to give birth most of the time. I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's not the real reason. The real reason is that they're just not going to follow through on the king's command. And no way we're going to do that. But God blesses them. They are courageous women, and they fear God more than anything. And then the story tells us again that the people multiplied and grew very, very strong. So, there's that idea again. God's at work behind the scenes. It's covenant language. It's a great story, but Pharaoh won't be outdone, will he? So he says, I'll try again with this whole infanticide thing. And so this time, he says, it's a boy, you throw it in the Nile and let it drown. This story in Exodus chapter 1, we just need to hear it properly, as it will help us if we hear it properly. This is a story about oppression. This is a story of great, great difficulty. In fact, the narrator is going out of his way to help us to feel their pain. He uses words like this. They set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They oppressed them. Then later on, they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work. In all the work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So when the narrator is just going on like that and using, synonym after synonym and, statement after statement about how dark it is, he wants you to feel their pain. He said, feel the pain? Could you imagine being these people? Like, I know it's a long time ago. It's like 3,500 years ago. But these are God's people, and they're really feeling terrible pain. In fact, another thing that sort of brings out their pain is when it comes to the infanticide. I've been talking about the fact that the king said, throw the boys in the river, but it doesn't actually use the word boys in the Hebrew. It uses the word sons, which does go a little bit further, doesn't it? It's kind of like, this is somebody's son, this is somebody's child, a mother and a father, all of their hopes and dreams residing in their children. And if it's a boy, you just kill it. Then I think this, just because you're God's people, do not think that you are not going to suffer terribly at the hands of other people sometimes. That's what this passage is about. It's oppression. It's deep and it's dark. And I don't know, all the stories here. But there probably is a bit of fear. Where's this all going with our society? Or maybe there's other things in your life, And being a Christian doesn't mean that it's not going to get hard. It's really important to hear that. Otherwise, you're going to get disillusioned. Being a Christian does not mean it's going to be an easy road. So good to follow that one away. But this is not just a story about oppression, thankfully. It's also a story about providence. The providence is already seen in this passage. We've seen the fact that the people multiplied, no matter how hard the king of Egypt tried to shut them down. And then we get to chapter 2, verse 1. I didn't read this far for us, didn't ask you to. But it goes on and it says this, and it's another story really about providence. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and she bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. It's because of the king's decree. And when she could hide him no longer, she took him in a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child and placed him amongst the reeds by the riverbank. This is great. This has entered the story of Moses, the key player in this whole story. Moses is about to be born, or is born. And it's a story about providence, isn't it? It's kind of not hard to see that. Providence being God is at work behind the scenes, and he's working his plan. And the providence in this passage here, chapter 2, actually comes to us once again through some women. We had the Hebrew midwives, God using them to perform his purposes, and now it's three other women. It's Moses' mother, find out her name a few chapters later, it's Jochebed, and it's Moses' sister, Miriam, and then it's Pharaoh's daughter as well, who remains unnamed. But it's this beautiful story, isn't it? Because here's Jochebed, here's Moses' mum. She gives birth to a child, it's a boy. And she just refuses to give in to the king's decree. She's not going to throw him in the river. She's not going to let him drown. But it gets to 3 months, and goodness me, he must be making a bit of noise by now, because that's what 3-month-old babies do. Well, mine did anyway. And it's kind of, she can't hide him anymore. Can you imagine just the horror that she must be feeling? I want to save this child, but I can't because he's so noisy. And everybody knows that I've got a baby boy when they go looking. So she makes a little boat, and she puts bitumen on it. And it kind of goes back to the Noah story, actually. Last time I read about a little boat covered in bitumen, or not so little boat, was Noah. And God saves Noah through the ark, and through that he saves humanity. And now God is saving Moses in a bitumen boat. And through him he's going to save his people. But Moses gets put in the river. And then, it's like, gosh, how lucky is this? Pharaoh's daughter comes along, and she just happens to be bathing there that day, and she hears the cries, and she opens it up, and she says, oh look, it's a Hebrew boy. This is good news. And she's so different to her father. Her father is, kill them. We don't care. These children, just annihilate them. But she's not like that. She's compassionate. She sees this baby boy, she's filled with pity. And then Miriam, standing on the sides, pops out of the bulrushes and says, hi. She says, it just so happens that I know there's a lady who can feed this child for you. He's not weaned yet. And Pharaoh's daughter says, okay, take him to her, and does the deal, and in God's providence, Moses' mother ends up raising Moses, at least for the first little while anyway. And then he goes to Pharaoh's household. And he gets adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, the text tells us. He becomes a prince of Egypt. There's a bit of irony there, isn't there? It's like the dynasty that wanted to kill the Hebrew boys ends up having a Hebrew boy as part of their dynasty. It's kind of like, oh, wow, that's a flip. But that's exactly what goes on. It's the providence of God. This is what's so good about this passage. You might not have picked it up, and we can read it all this morning. But God hardly gets mentioned up until this point in the story. He gets mentioned once by, in regard to the Hebrew midwives. God dealt graciously with them and blessed them. But other than that, God's missing in the whole narrative. Doesn't get mentioned. And that's just how it is, isn't it? Don't you think? That's what maybe is scary. It is scary, God, are you really there? Are you listening? Do you see our plight? Do you see our trouble? And sometimes it just feels like heaven is quiet, doesn't it? It's like, it's silent. Is God really there? But I think what we're supposed to understand when we read this passage is that he actually is there. And sometimes while we can't see him, his fingerprints are everywhere. All over the story. It's not luck at all that Pharaoh's daughter has a compassionate heart and that she is bathing by the reeds. It's the providence of God. He is at work. But we just have to be patient sometimes. But he is at work. The winds of opposition blow pretty strong sometimes. And it feels like they're blowing right through us. And it's a scary place to be. But God is at work. And really the last idea of the story is that we just have to wait. We have to wait. This is how it goes. Moses grows up, his story leaps forward 40 years all of a sudden, and you get down to verse 11 of chapter 2. It says this: one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian, and he hid him in the sand, buried him. So there's kind of like a story behind the story, you think, don't you reckon? Like, Moses pops up out of nowhere 40 years later and he kills this Egyptian because he doesn't like the way he's treating the Hebrews. And there is a story behind that. It's interesting. You roll forward around about 1,500 years from here and you end up in the book of Acts. And we get a little bit more detail around it. It's kind of a cute, important little verse. It's spoken by Stephen as he's about to die. And Stephen sort of gives the history, and he says this: when Moses was 40 years old, he's telling the people that are hating him, he says, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. Well, we know that, but why did he do it? Well, just this: he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. But they did not understand. See, this is really important. It doesn't actually tell us in this narrative, but this is what's going on in Moses' head between his ears. He says, I'm the Prince of Egypt. And he starts having compassionate thoughts for his own people. He says, I'm strong. He starts flexing his muscles and he says, I'm going to be their deliverer. By the might of my hand, I am going to deliver my own people. I don't know what his plan is. Kill one Egyptian, that'll do it. I don't know what he's thinking, but he does think that he's a strong man and that he's going to push back on this and he's going to be the deliverer. That's what he thinks, by his strength. But it doesn't actually go very well. It just pear-shapes really quickly. And people aren't listening to him, as it turns out. So you keep on reading back in Exodus, and we're told this: he stops a fight the next day between two Hebrews after killing the Egyptian the day before. And they say, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid. And he thought, surely this thing is known. I think he's right. And then when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. This is what I think we're supposed to understand, as I understand it. Moses is a defeated man. Moses, the Prince of Egypt, who thought that he could deliver by his might and his strength his people, has had to run away like a scared child because Pharaoh wants to kill him. I reckon there's a good chance that we're supposed to understand that Moses is a disillusioned man at this point. Everything that he thought he was going to be has been taken away. In fact, it reads that way just in the last few verses, to summarise the last part of the chapter. He rocks up in Midian, a bloke by the name of Ruel befriends him. He says, here's one of my daughters, Zipporah, you can marry her. Then you get down to one of the last verses in chapter 2, and it sounds a lot like the first verse in chapter 2. It says this, verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man. He gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. It's kind of like the first couple of verses, because in the first couple of verses you have a Hebrew man who takes a wife and she gives birth to a son, but it's desperate times. And now you have Moses growing up, taking a wife, giving birth to a son, but it's also desperate times because he says, I am a sojourner in a foreign land. And the idea is, I'm a stranger. I am no longer with my own people. I've had to flee. I've had to go. I'm not with the covenant people of God. So I want us to hear that Moses is a man who's probably disillusioned. He's a man who's lost his way. And isn't life like that sometimes for us? Sometimes we can start really strong and we can start passionately and we say, I don't care what the world does. I'm going to take it on. You know, we puff out our chest and we head out there bold and, you know, full of vigour. But then the winds of opposition blow, and they blow for a long, long time. And it has a tendency to dull the edge on our faith. Sometimes we can lose faith. We say, it's just so hard. You know, it's just been hard for a long time. And I've failed plenty of times, and it just doesn't seem like God's come through. And that's just what it's like. And that's exactly what's going on in this passage. That just brings us back right to the beginning. What are we supposed to think? What does God want us to think when life is like that? What do you reckon? Well, it's just this. This whole passage goes full circle and it tells us a little secret right at the end. And it's all about God. He wasn't missing after all. It says this, during those many days of oppression and hardship, many days, the king of Egypt died. And still the people groaned because of their slavery. And their groan, their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Isn't that great? Where's God? What does he want us to think? Well, God wants us to understand that when it's really difficult, do you want to know what he's doing? He's listening. He's watching. And he is remembering his promise to his people. The people that it's really nice, the people that he knows. The people that he knows. This is about intimacy. I know those people, and I'm watching. See, that's the narrative that we need to hear, folks. There's another narrative being spoken of this world, deconstruction, and you're all on your own, and, you know, this is evil and this is good. But we don't listen to that narrative. Listen to the narrative that says that God is really the king of this world. And he is watching. And he's listening. And when you pray, he hears. And he remembers his promise. Isn't that the gospel? It is the gospel. That Jesus, the great King of kings, came into this world. And he lived amongst us, and he went to the cross, and he died. It is history. 2,000 years ago. And he died for the sins of the world, to defeat the great enemies, sin, Satan, and death itself. And he rose victorious. And he will never forget us, never walk away from us. He always remembers his covenant people, and we are people of the new covenant. And one day he will come again, and we will right all wrongs. So we need to remember that. That is the narrative. We've got to be careful to what story we listen to in this world. And this is the point of those first two chapters. A story that tells us that God is not absent after all, that he is at work. And in our case, he has done something spectacular. In their case, he had done something spectacular. The covenant with Abraham. And he will continue his work. So stay on the winning side. Remember that truth as you face all that this world has. Let's pray. We thank you, Father, for this beautiful text, this beautiful story. It is the story of this world. And all the different things we've got rattling around in our brains, the things that we are afraid of. May we fear you the most because we realise that you're the one that we need to be in awe of the most. And you are the one who has all things in control. Thank you for the story. May we be encouraged by it today, we pray. In Jesus' name.